Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Huck's in here, we're just running around. She's a good girl. She's the executive producer of the show. And she's demanding more money, more time, and more time off. Right? Good girl. Okay, so she'll be spending time in here. This is a missing persons segment. And it's a missing truckers segment. And this one is a doozy, folks. And I mean that sincerely. We've covered a lot of ground with truckers. And I don't look for these weird associations between truckers and other things and how somebody became a trucker. These have just come up. This case came up in our research. Missing trucker found. All right. What does that mean? Well, this is how the story goes. Man's name was John Commons. He was 39 years old when he went missing August 1st, 1930. John had a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin in 1925 for economics and a master's degree from the same institution for economics. He was married to a woman named Ellen Commons. He was a veteran and he was a lieutenant in Company K, 330th Infantry in the Russian Expeditionary Force. And he actually got several meritorious awards while he was in the military. He came back and he became a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Wisconsin. And his father was a very world-famous economist also named John Commons. And he and Ellen resided in Madison, Wisconsin. There's a lot of Commons going on here, so if you get confused, don't be surprised. Now, he was teaching college classes at the university. His dad was also teaching at the university. They had a great relationship. And he and his wife described the relationship as really good. Well, just prior to August 1st, 1930, John had complained and talked to his wife that he had been attacked somehow by some unknown something. Someone. It was very unclear. And he had repeatedly been threatened. And his wife thought it was, the way he had explained it, it was strange and odd. And then on August 1st, he took his car and he made a trip to school and he disappeared. And on late that day, she reported her husband and the cars both missing. 3 days later, on August 4th, John's car was found abandoned in Chicago. During a police investigation on the case, and it got notoriety even at the time because John's dad was so famous, and because he was a professor himself, that to disappear under these circumstances were truly odd. But she said they had a good marriage, they never fought, that was Huck, and everything was good. Well, Huck has to go. She has other appointments to do, apparently. There you go. It's a good girl. Thank you. So, over the course of the next few years, Mrs. Commons did everything she could to try to track down John. She went to Chicago, the neighborhood where they found the car, hoping to find somebody that knew him, saw him, heard of him. Nothing. They also had a young daughter at the time. And it was tough on the family as a whole. Now, Mrs. Commons was a librarian and had a job, but for those 7 years, she contacted and stayed in close contact with his dad, hoping that he'd make contact with him. Nobody heard anything. And in November, early November of 1938, Mrs. Commons got a formal divorce from John and then simultaneously petitioned the court to classify him as legally deceased. The rationale behind that is that she wanted single custody of the daughter to make legal decisions. And they also had a life insurance policy. And if he was listed as legally deceased, the life insurance would pay out. Well, he had never contacted his dad. He had never contacted the daughter or his wife. And the court granted the divorce and 100% custody to Ellen. And the life insurance policy was for right around $10,000. And that he and Ellen had a couple years before that borrowed against the policy $3,000. So in essence, it was a payoff of about $7,000. Now, at about this point, Ellen decided to move her and her daughter to Washington, D.C., where she got a job, a really good job, for working for the Social Security Administration as a librarian in their division. Good job. Well, as time went on, nobody had heard from John Jr., and everyone thought he had died somewhere, but they weren't sure where. Ellen had some thoughts that maybe the threats that John had or received were real, but she also had thoughts that maybe it was a mental illness that possibly took his life. Well, nothing happened until June of 1944. Several newspapers in Connecticut and Wisconsin were working together because they had received a tip that John Commons Jr. was alive and living in Hartford, Connecticut. So they did their work and they tried to be quiet about it. And they thought that they had a location where he was at. So they contacted the Hartford police. And they said that someone that's been listed as missing since 1930 is in reality living in Hartford in a rooming house. So the police detective on the case was smart. And this is what a lot of policemen don't do. He went out, and before he ever went to the house, he contacted John's dad, contacted the wife, and learned everything he could about John before he approached this person. And this person was living under the name of John Commons. He would have been about the right age. And the police decided that it was time to make the approach. So they went to this rooming house and they contacted the man. They had found out that he was a hard worker. He had no police record. He had not attempted to conceal his identity in any way. And in fact, they went backwards in time and found out that he had applied for and listed himself as a civil service person and had listed himself at other locations updating a civil service record. Well, John, when he was approached, immediately admitted that he was the John Commons, the professor from Madison, Wisconsin. Can you just imagine what that detective must have thought when he heard this? Well, the detective started to question him about when did you realize who you were, or what's the timeline, and where have you been for 14 years? Well, John said he last remembered being at the university. And then he said the next thing he remembers is being at a mental institution on the west coast of the United States. He didn't say what institution. He said he didn't know the circumstances, didn't know how he got there, didn't know why it was there. But he said he kind of woke up and he realized that he was okay. And he says, I just left. Didn't look back. And he said that he remembers working in the southwest of the United States on farms. And then he said he went to New York and he worked on a tugboat for a while. And then he said he was working now as a laundry truck driver for about the last year. Well, that's pretty interesting. Now, in all of the research we did on this case, it was never made specifically clear at what point John realized who he was. But it had to have been in the last several years, because he said he didn't realize why he was in the mental hospital, and he didn't realize where he was from at that point. So it had to be more recently. Police explained to John that there were people in Madison who knew who he was and that he was living in Connecticut. And he said that he had been communicating with friends in Madison, and he wasn't trying to conceal who he was. And he says, I wasn't trying to keep it a secret, but once I realized who I was, I just said it. Now, the Hartford police contacted Madison police and had them cancel the missing persons bulletin that had been out for 14 years. Now, the police in Hartford contacted the insurance company that paid off the insurance policy and explained to them all the facts. A couple weeks later, the insurance company came back and said that they wouldn't go after Ellen to recollect on the policy they paid out because a judge had deemed John was deceased. There was no fraud on the part of Mrs. Commons or on John. So they let her keep the money. Well, was now Ms. Ellen Commons, was still living as a librarian in D.C., and she was contacted by newspapers and asked if she would recontact John and try to reconcile. She said she would not, and she was very short with her response. July 18th, 1944. The police had been in contact with John's father, also named John Commons, who had moved to Florida about 10 years earlier, in about 1934, after he retired from the University of Wisconsin. And he was living in the Fort Lauderdale area. And they were trying to understand if he knew any of the issues behind John being missing, about John possibly having any mental health issues. And his dad said that he didn't know of any. And then they asked him if it was okay if they gave his contact information to the son. Well, John Sr. was a bit apprehensive that this was really his son. And the police said they were 100% convinced it was his son. And John Sr. said, yeah, go ahead and give him my information. So John Jr. contacted his dad and said he'd like to come down to Fort Lauderdale, reconnect, and talk. Well, the father let the press know that his son was coming down, said the date and time, and there were a lot of press. And then John Jr. made the trip by train from Hartford, Connecticut to Fort Lauderdale. And they were on the railroad platform, the press was, when John Jr. and John Sr. saw each other. Now, before we go much further, this is John Jr. Now, just about any criteria you could give, he came from a brilliant background. His dad was a world-famous economist. He was an economist professor at the University of Wisconsin. So he came from very, very smart background. I guess you could say he was probably an intellect. And now he's driving a truck for a laundry service. And he's happy with it. Well, they're on the platform. John Jr. gets off the train. And the first thing he says when he walks up to his dad is, "It's wonderful to be with you again, Dad." And he gives him a big hug. There were tears. Father said he was overjoyed to see his son. I could not even begin to comprehend the feelings of his dad at that moment. Because once you come to the reality that your son is deceased, it's such a hard reckoning. It's one that just tears you apart. And then over time, everybody says, "Oh yeah, Dave, it'll get better." It doesn't really get better. It's like a scar that never heals in my mind. It's always there. I always think about it. I can guarantee John Common Sr. thought about it every day. Till that day on the platform. He sees his son. But the reason we're talking about this, damnedest thing, truck driver coincidence again. The man who had amnesia for years, I don't know, at least months and months and months. How did he get from Chicago to the west coast of the United States? That's beyond my understanding. And he couldn't explain it. He never was asked to explain the threats or the attacks that he said he had to his wife. Police never got into that publicly. And the police never, ever made any innuendo that John Jr. was, when they talked to him, was mentally ill or had any issues. If anything, the implication was he was overly, what's the right word, cooperative with the police. This is a weird case, folks, because you don't have that many professors that just drop out. Once you reach that level in an academic institution, you're pretty well home. Your career's made. So for him to drop out had to be something serious. Now, as you know, we have a classification in missing 411 called intellects. And it includes college professors, physicians, etc. Super, super smart people that disappeared. Now, technically, 14 years, John was missing and gone. Everyone presumed he was dead. The judge said he was dead. So my question is, how many of the missing 411 cases that I've talked about have a victim like John that is actually living somewhere? Now, what happened? We really don't know. But when you think about, he's an intellect, he's missing time, he had amnesia, his car's parked in Chicago, right next to a Great Lake. He's a truck driver. You just can't ignore these things. And it was such an extended period of time that I thought about his daughter. Did the daughter ever reach out and make contact with John Jr. again? Did his mind heal enough so he understood he even had a daughter? My heart and soul would be beckoning to see her, wanting to be with her. But yet that wasn't ever mentioned in any of the articles other than he had a daughter. It's the part I don't understand. These cases are troubling to me because they're so open-ended. A lot of you have written in and said, oh, Dave, this is, they're spraying things in people's faces and they're causing them to lose memory. Or I've read all kinds of comments. But I'm a pretty well-read person, and back in the 1930s and 40s, I question whether we had any of this type of technology back then. But then when you go from the 30s to the 40s and the amount of things that happened in the United States that were paranormal were a lot. And I always ask myself, was the U.S. government paying attention to these type of cases that we're talking about and coming to the realization that there's something at play here that they can't control and they don't understand? Now, I understand today that there's many people out there who believe that our government is actually doing this right now to our people. I hear that all the time. But back in the 1930s to the 1940s, did we really have that ability? Or did we learn to get this ability from somebody or something else? And then what would be the purpose in us disrupting people's lives in this manner? Now, did John Jr. have some intellectual horsepower that somebody needed? Wanted? Was he good breeding stock? I don't know. Just food for thought. But what I'd like you to do is to think about this. And if I could get your mind to start thinking about this in a different way than we would normally, then I've really done something. So please share this on your social media. I'm still signing posters. You can still get them in time for Christmas at NA, like North America, BigfootSearch.com. Go to the online store and you can see posters, books, etc. Still get them to you by Christmas. And I'm on Twitter, David Paulides at CanAm Missing. Post there 2 or 3 times a day on different things. And I'm ever grateful for you being here today. You are appreciated in ways I could never explain. But we need you to watch the whole segment of this. And there's 650 other videos that if you're watching them, or you're even just listening to them, keep them on in the background as you do your housework. That helps us immensely. There's a lot of videos there. Be nice to your neighbors. Do something kind for someone out there today. Have a great week. Paulides out.